Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 1 lecture. Chapter 1 will cover the introduction to drugs and society. So let's start with our learning objectives. The learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to explain how drug use is affected by biological, genetic, pharmacological, cultural, social, and contextual factors. You should be able to explain when drugs were first used and under what circumstances, to indicate how widespread drug use is, why people use drugs, and who potential drug users or abusers are, to list the most commonly used licit and illicit drugs, describe how the mass media promotes drug use, and to explain when drug use leads to abuse, as well as list and explain the stages of drug dependence, and finally, to explain the holistic self-awareness approach. So we'll begin by discussing drug use. So drug use actually causes 4 simultaneous changes. The first is a social, psychological basis of attraction to the drug. So this is when one feels rewarded or satisfied because social pressures can appear to have become postponed, momentarily rectified, or neutralized and perceived as non-problematic. The second is pharmacologically. So this is where the drug actually alters the body's chemistry, largely by interfering with homeostatic functioning. So the drugs either enhance, depress, accelerate, or distort the perceptions of reality for that individual. They also satisfy inborn or genetically programmed needs and desires, so they can just satisfy these inborn or again genetically programmed needs and desires. And lastly, psychoactive. So psychoactive drugs will actually interfere with the way that neurons send, receive, and process signals from neurotransmitters. So drug users can be classified or there can be 2 classifications for drug use. So you have insiders and outsiders. Insiders are those who are drug users, while outsiders are typically looked at as non-users. So these 2 classifications have resulted in varying sets of values and attitudes about drug use when you look at them. So insiders will feel one way about drugs and drug use, while outsiders will typically hold a different set of values and attitudes towards using drugs. Now we're going to look at the 4 principal factors that affect how a drug user will experience a drug. So the first is biological, genetic, or pharmacological. So this is how the ingredients are actually affecting the body and the nervous system. The second is cultural. So this includes society's view on the drugs, including both customs and traditions. Social. So this is going to be the motivation for taking the drug. So is this to cure an illness, for relaxation? Is it to decrease pain? As well as the person's beliefs and attitudes about the drug use that they perceive from their peers, from family, and from their communities. And then contextual. So these are the social behaviors of those who the person is around, as well as the physical surroundings. So when we look at psychoactive drugs, this is the preferred term to refer to drugs that will affect the mind and body by altering the mood, consciousness, thought processes, perception, or behavior of that individual. Typically, these are used to treat physical, psychological, or mental illnesses, and when using these drugs, a tolerance can be built. So the central nervous system is what's affected by these psychoactive drugs, and the central nervous system includes the spinal cord and the brain. So this is responsible for integrating both sensory information and responding accordingly when that information comes in. So addiction is mostly psychological and attachment, and it's defined as a complex condition because it's defined now as a brain disease that is manifested by compulsive substance use, despite the fact that there are many harmful consequences the person will experience. And those harmful consequences can include withdrawal symptoms. So withdrawal symptoms are defined as psychological or physical that will result from the person not taking that drug. So what are the 6 types of commonly abused drugs? The first we'll look at is prescription. So prescription drug use has actually increased the last 10 to 15 years because they've been viewed as more safe. So misuse is actually highest among those aged 18 to 25. Opioid prescriptions are going to treat pain, while those that suffer from anxiety or sleep disorders may be prescribed a CNS depressant. Stimulants typically treat ADHD, and abusers of this drug tend to be those who are in late middle school, high school, or college students. And these stimulants will actually act on the CNS or central nervous system to increase alertness, excitation, euphoria, the pulse rate, and blood pressure of that person. And then psychotherapeutic prescriptions are those that are treating mental disorders, depression, and schizophrenia. Over the counter, or as you'll see in the subsequent lectures, OTC drugs. These are those that you can purchase, such as cold and cough medicines that you can just get from the store without having a prescription. Recreational drugs are considered coffee, tea, alcohol, tobacco, and even chocolate is included in recreational. So these are ones that are obviously legal, some of them legal only once you reach a certain age, but you don't need a prescription and they're not considered over-the-counter medications because they're not treating any condition or illness. You then have illicit drugs, which just means that they're illegal. Herbal preparations are, your herbal supplements, and these just herbal means that they're just derived from plants. And then you have commercial. So commercial drugs are your paints, glues, and household cleaning products that are typically inhaled. So now we're going to look at the major drugs of use. So the first group are hallucinogens, psychedelics, and similar drugs. So this includes your LSDs, your MDMA, and magic mushrooms. So these are psychoactive drugs that will interfere with the way that a neuron sends, receives, and processes signals from neurotransmitters. So this can affect the taste, smell, hearing, and vision of the person taking these drugs. Depressants actually depress the central nervous system. So they can produce an insensibility, or what we refer to as a stupor, and an example of a depressant would be alcohol. You then have nicotine, which everyone knows are in cigarettes, and cannabis, which includes both marijuana and hashish. So cannabis is the most widely used illicit drug in the United States, and THC is primarily psychoactive and has mind-altering ingredients. Then we have the group of designer drugs, synthetic and synthetic opioids. So these include your synthetic cannabinoids, such as spice and K2. So these were actually human-made mind-altering chemicals that are typically sprayed onto a dried plant material that is then smoked or sold as a liquid for e-cigarettes. So these became popular quite a number of years ago. Instead of using cannabis or marijuana, a lot of younger, we'll say high school, middle school age students were buying spice and K2 because at the time it was not illegal. You then have your anabolic steroids. So these are typically used to increase muscle size and strength of the individual, but side effects can include not only high blood pressure, but manic episodes, genital atrophy, and even violence being exhibited in that person. You then have inhalants and organic solvents. And then narcotics and opiates. So your narcotics and opiates are actually going to depress the CNS, and they're highly addictive. So these are your heroin, your opium, morphines, and codeines. So remember, this is just an introduction to all of the drugs. We will go into greater detail throughout the semester on all of these. So when we look at society and drug use, let's look at the history of drugs being used. So in the Grecian oracles of Delphi, they used drugs. Homer's Nestor's cup was actually used to induce sleep and provided freedom from care. So the person, drinking it didn't have a care in the world. The mandrake root in the Bible was actually associated with bartering for lovemaking. And if we look back to the Code of Hammurabi, drinking was described as a problem for men who had too much leisure time and a lazy disposition. So the extent and frequency of drug use can be defined in 4 different ways or by 4 different terms. So while the United States accounts for only 5% of the world's population, we actually consume 75% of the world's prescription drugs. Just an interesting fact. So first we're going to look at legal instrumental. So legal instrumental drug use refers to taking a prescribed drug or an over-the-counter drug to relieve or treat mental or physical symptoms. So it's legal that you can take it, and it's instrumental in that it's treating a mental or physical symptom. You then have legal recreational. So this is using licit drugs such as tobacco, alcohol, or caffeine to achieve a certain mental or psychic state. So again, they're legal. You can consume tobacco, you can consume alcohol. Again, once you reach a certain age, and they're recreational. So it's not to treat a mental or physical ailment. It's simply for recreational use. You then have illegal instrumental. So this is taking drugs without a prescription to accomplish a task or a goal. So maybe someone needs to stay up and study for a big exam. So they're going to take Adderall. That would be considered illegal instrumental use. You don't have a prescription for that Adderall. You maybe got it from a friend, but it's instrumental because you're taking it for a specific task or to complete a specific task. And then you have illegal recreational. So this is simply taking illicit drugs for fun or pleasure. So maybe taking some club drugs while you're out at the club, for example, to increase or enhance the effects that you experience at that club already. But what are the costs of using licit and illicit psychoactive drugs? When we look at social, alcohol actually accounted for $249 billion that were spent per year. Tobacco was $300 billion a year. When we look at prescription drugs generated $844 billion worldwide just in the year 2019. Over-the-counter drug sales were about $35 billion in 2018, while between roughly $1 trillion were spent between the years 2000 and 2010 on illicit drugs. And then looking at non-medical use and misuse of prescription drugs, so this is not for a medical purpose and not because the prescription drug is being taken properly. This is going to include your heroin, your opioids, and your pain relievers. These all equal to 10 million people in 2017 who were either using or misusing prescription type drugs. And then the cost for miscellaneous costs and miscellaneous drugs, it just can't be accounted for. It's very difficult to get those facts and figures. So in 2016, it was actually estimated that 48 million people aged 12 years and older reported using illicit drugs or misusing prescription drugs the prior year. So that would have been in 2015. These rates were highest among males, those aged 18 to 25, and those who were designated as American Indian or Alaska Natives. More than half of new illicit drug users typically started with marijuana, followed by prescription pain relievers, and then increased their use up to inhalants. That's why they have said for years that marijuana is a gateway drug. Alcohol actually has the highest rate of dependence among all drugs, followed by marijuana. Interestingly, high school students have actually steadily declined in their use of tobacco. However, all grades have increased their use of marijuana. And full-time college students had similar rates of marijuana use to their similar aged counterparts who were not attending college. So we'll say that group of, between those ages of 18 to 21, 22, where you're in college, whether you're in college or out of college, rates of marijuana use were equal across the board. So what are some patterns that we see with illicit and licit drug use? Well, shows the approximate percentage of Americans aged 12 years or older who have used drugs at all in their lifetime. So a study was done on this age group of Americans. 80% used alcohol, 56% used cigarettes, 50% used illicit drugs, and 45% used marijuana. So here you have the chart on the right which shows those figures. So interestingly, the highest percentage of illicit drug use, again, was among those aged 18 to 25 years. So what are the demographic differences for those who use illicit drugs? When we look at race and ethnicity, usage is actually highest in Blacks and African Americans, but lowest in those of Asian descent. When we look at gender, males use consistently at higher rates than females do, and they're more likely to be co-occurring users, so they're using more than one drug at the same time. Looking at the level of education the person has, we see the lowest drug use among college graduates, but the highest use among high school graduates or those that only have some college education. And when we say college graduates, we mean those graduating with a bachelor's degree from a four-year school. And then when we look at the criminal justice populations and those who have been arrested, roughly a quarter of those who are 18 years of age or older that are either on parole or supervised release from prison are currently an illicit drug user. Roughly a quarter. So we have a very high percentage of parolees and those on supervision who use drugs. And approximately 30% of those who are on probation are current illicit drug users. So let's look at the different types of users that you can have. There are three categories. You have the experimenter, the compulsive user, and then your floaters or chippers. So your experimenter drug user typically can be peer pressured easily and is using drugs out of curiosity. They're typically only using in recreational settings, not just sitting at home by themselves. They use with their peers, and they'll usually set limits on their use so they don't use excessively or they don't use all the time, again, because they're only using in those recreational settings. And stimulants tend to be the drug of choice. When we look at the compulsive user, these users devote a considerable amount of time and energy to drug use. They use these drugs to escape their personal problems, avoid stress and anxiety, or because they want to feel the euphoric effects. These individuals typically have low self-esteem. They may come from dysfunctional families, and they have persistent problems with the law as a result of their drug use. They may also have underlying psychological problems, again, that maybe they're treating because they're trying to avoid anxiety or the feelings that come along with anxiety. And then you have your floaters or your chippers. So these users have an unconscious need to seek pleasure from their drug use. So they have a desire to relieve either psychological problems, and they will typically have these are your light to moderate users. They're marginally attached to conventional society, and they may appear conventional. So they may appear like they do not have a drug problem. They may do well at their job. They may be, working a 9 to 5, and they don't give any of the signs that they're a drug user. but they're not committed to continued use. So they're only using in specific moments or specific times. And again, they're still marginally attached to conventional society. When we look at adolescent users, it's interesting to see that digital peer pressure actually appears to have played a significant role in getting teens to start using drugs and alcohol. So in a study, 75% of respondents actually said that seeing pictures on Facebook of their peers partying with alcohol and marijuana was a catalyst for them to want to imitate their friends to use those drugs. So they use drugs because they want to fit in with their peers. They want to feel good. The example I gave earlier, they want to feel better, but they want to do better maybe in school, or they're simply experimenting because they're curious. So adolescent users are going to use for much different reasons. I wouldn't say much different, but for different reasons than adults would. There are risk factors that can actually increase one's vulnerability to addiction. So those adolescents may want to be careful or be mindful of these different factors that could increase those being vulnerable to leading to a long-term addiction while they're maybe just experimenting, or they maybe just wanted to feel good in that moment. If they're not aware of these, it could lead to long-term addiction. So we look at family history, abuse, neglect, or traumatic experiences, having a mental disorder or more than one mental disorder, using drugs early, so starting drug use as a teen, and the method of administration. So the way that you're taking the drug into your body, orally, injection, inhaling, which we'll cover in a later chapter. So genes, mental health, family, and the society and social environment all play a role in addiction. There's not just one factor that can cause someone to become addicted to drugs. And we must also take into account the effect that mass media can have on drug use. So again, digital peer pressure plays a significant role in teens beginning their use of drugs and alcohol. Television was found to be one of the most influential. So spending on direct advertisements for healthcare services actually increased $8 billion from 1997 until 2016. So individuals are seeing the different healthcare services and drug advertisements more because more money was being spent on them from 1997 to 2016. And out-of-pocket costs for these drugs actually increased $212 billion. Interestingly, alcohol companies did spend almost $5 billion on ads just in a 4-year span. Only 2% of that was on responsibility ads. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen them, don't drive drunk, buzz driving, is drunk driving. Only 2% of that $5 billion was spent on those types of ads. Everything else was on promoting their alcohol. So we've talked about adolescents. Now let's look at drug use in older adults. So roughly 25% of older adults will use a prescription psychoactive medication that has the potential to be either misused or abused. Use of psychoactive older adults typically use psychoactive medications longer than younger adults. Alcohol and medication misuse together actually affects approximately 19% of older Americans. And alcohol is the primary substance of abuse, followed by opiates. So when we say older adults, we're talking about those who would be, say, your grandparents, not, 20s and 30s. We're looking more to 50s and 60s and older. And this was also, again, interesting. I feel like I've said that a lot. But marijuana use is more common among those in the bracket of 50 to 59 years. The non-medical use of prescription drugs, however, is most common for those who are 65 and older. So we have a difference here. Those who are 65 and older are typically using prescription drugs for non-medical use, while those who are 50 to 59 are using marijuana. So why do people use drugs? Well, one is for pleasure. It heightens those feelings that you feel good. To relieve stress, tension, or even anxiety. You come home from a very long day of work once you're over 21, and you want to maybe have a glass of wine to relax for the evening. That's why a lot of people use alcohol, or using alcohol out at bars, to relieve that anxiety or social anxiety that someone may have being in those social settings. To either forget problems and avoid worries that you may have. Sometimes a necessary relaxation to fit in with your peers. Sometimes it's also seen as a rite of passage. So obviously when you turn 21 and you go to the bar for your first drink, could be an example of your rite of passage. To enhance religious or mystical experiences, these aren't common so much anymore, but it can be used. To relieve pain, and even resuming drug use from your early adult life. So there's some examples in your book if you read through the different vignettes where it explains how there's an individual who, even though he used to use drugs more frequently back in college, he doesn't do that so much anymore because he has a family and children and a job that he needs to tend to. But occasionally he'll go out with his friends on the weekends or visit with a friend and re-engage in that same drug use that they would when they were in college. So when does use lead to abuse? Well, it depends on the amount. So the amount and frequency of drug use does not necessarily determine whether it's going to be abused or not. Motive, however, is the most important factor. So those who are feeling pressures of work, chronic depression, and those who are unable to focus on completing goals may choose to use a stimulant such as cocaine. Those who feel anxiety and want to relieve the pressures of life may choose to use a depressant such as alcohol. And those who are feeling artistic and just want to unlock some of their talents may choose to use a hallucinogenic type of drug. So the motive, not necessarily the amount or how often the drug's being used, can determine abuse. So initial drug abuse symptoms to look out for are excessive use, having a constant preoccupation about whether that drug is available or not to that person. So can I drink when I get home? Do I have alcohol at home? Or am I going to have to stop at the beer store on my way home to make sure that I have it? So constantly thinking about that, say while you're at work, could be a symptom or a sign of initial drug abuse. Denying that your use is excessive. So when someone points it out, are you saying, no, I'm fine. No, you're exaggerating. I'm not using that much. And being reliant on that drug. People who are alcoholics will have to typically use alcohol throughout the day to continue functioning. You may have heard the term functioning alcoholic. So it's true, which we'll learn about all the effects of these types of drugs later on, but that individual needs that drug to continue operating throughout the day. And typically, when it results in withdrawal symptoms or neglecting responsibilities. So use can be considered abuse when, again, those withdrawal symptoms are occurring and the person is maybe neglecting the responsibilities that they have in this world. So there's an argument, though, that says taking a drug for psychological needs can be just as legitimate as that for physical needs. Do you agree? Something to consider. So once we've acknowledged that someone maybe their use is starting to lead to abuse, we can check out this drug dependence and look at this wheel or cycle of drug dependence. So physical and psychological factors will actually precipitate drug dependence. So when we look at physical dependence, it's the need to continue taking a drug to avoid those physical withdrawal symptoms. Psychological dependence then occurs when there's a need to continue experiencing the effects of the drug. So recently, more attention has been placed on the mental or psychological aspects of dependence. So when we go over here to our wheel or our cycle, We start with relief. So the drug, where we're using a drug and we experience relief in some form, whether it's relieving our stress and anxiety, for example, or maybe it's relieving our pain or back pain. This then can lead into increased use, so taking greater quantities of the drug. This then leads into preoccupation, so having a continued interest with taking and acquiring that drug. Can then lead into dependency. So this is synonymous with addiction. This is continued use of the drug despite the physical complications that come as a result of that continued use. This then leads into withdrawal, which those symptoms can include itching, chills, tension, stomach pain, and even depression from non-use of the drug. And the cycle just keeps continuing. So let's look at the different costs of drug use. Heroin costs roughly $5 to $10 for a stamped bag. For one individual, this could be roughly up to $200 a day, which could be a $55,000 to $73,000 a year habit. Crimes related to drugs typically are going to involve theft of personal property, assault, and robbery. So it costs roughly $75 to $1,500 to incarcerate a person for one day. Federal inmates typically cost an average of $84 per day. However, non-hospital residential methadone treatment, so the individual's not in a hospital setting, but it is residential, so they're not going home, they're in a physical building. Methadone treatment costs $76 a day. So you'll see it's less than the federal inmate would cost per day and roughly about the same as the minimum to incarcerate a person. Outpatient methadone treatment, however, costs only $18 a day. So I will ask you, do you think it makes more sense economically and socially to give an individual outpatient treatment than it is to incarcerate that drug addict? And then let's look at the long-term societal impacts. So you have diseases from sharing needles. Drug use during pregnancy can lead to a greater number of babies that are going into the welfare system. Obviously, the cost of death, the number of ER visits and hospital stays that drug-addicted person will have, and an increased number of automobile fatalities. So these are all societal impacts that we experience as a result of individuals using drugs. But again, if we want to look economically, providing treatment to an individual rather than incarceration costs much less. So there are two competing hypotheses when we look at drugs, crime, and violence. So putting all this together and relating it to now crime, because this class is substance abuse and crime, there's two competing hypotheses. The first is that criminal behavior will develop as a means to support the person's addiction. So a person becomes addicted to a drug, they're now stealing. They're now assaulting people because they're trying to rob them for money. Or the other hypothesis says that criminality is simply inherent in one's personality and will occur independent of that drug use. So it's not the drug use or addiction that's causing that person to go out and commit assaults and robberies. It's in fact the criminality that's inherent in their personality. So these are the two competing hypotheses we have today. So individuals who use illicit drugs are typically more likely to commit crime. So remember, illicit, illegal. There's a high percentage of drug users that are arrested for drug use and violence that are more likely to be under the influence of either alcohol or a stimulant than other types of drugs. The United States is #1 in the world for incarcerating people in both state and federal prisons. Nearly 50% of federal inmates are serving time for drug offenses, and almost all of those are for drug trafficking. While nearly 50% of inmates are clinically addicted, and approximately 60% of arrestees were found to be positive for an illegal drug at the time of their arrest. The US also incarcerates more people for drug offenses than any other country does. Roughly 86% of our incarcerated persons are for possession of a controlled substance, so simply having a controlled substance on their person, and we'll talk about controlled substances and how they schedule those later. And roughly 14% were for selling or manufacturing the drug. So when we talk about these drug traffickers, when we talk about selling and manufacturing and possession of controlled substance, we have to talk about drug cartels. So cartels are defined as large, highly sophisticated organizations that are composed of multiple drug trafficking organizations. Drug cells are then smaller units. They consist of 3 to 5 members and are responsible for ensuring operational security. So looking at transportation, security, or possibly the money laundering. And this was exemplified in the show Ozark on Netflix, if anyone has watched that. So drug cartels are obviously a major issue. You'll watch a video in this week's module on drug cartels, which account for a large number of those drug trafficking offenses. So we're switching gears a little bit here, but we're going to look at substance abuse in the workplace. So what are the costs to the company and society when individuals use and abuse substances while they're working? There's lost productivity. Workplace accidents and injuries also increase. We have employee absenteeism increasing. Morale is lowered, and illness is increased. So alcohol use is actually, the current usage of alcohol is actually higher for full-time employed adults who are 18 years of age and older than those who are unemployed. So let me say that again. Those who are employed full-time actually use alcohol more than those who are unemployed. When we look at tobacco use, cigarette smoking is more common in those who are unemployed than those who are employed full or part-time. And when we look at substance dependence, so those who are dependent on a substance, it is higher for those who are unemployed than those who are employed full or part-time. So again, when we look at these costs that the company will have to absorb and also to society, employees will or are 3 times as likely to be late when they abuse substances. They're 3 times more likely to receive sick benefits. They're 16 times more likely to be absent from work. 5 times more likely to be involved in accidents on the job, and 5 times more likely to file compensation claims through workers' compensation. So you can see here how substance abuse and use among those who are employed costs not just that individual and their family, but it costs the company as well, because these companies need to have employee assistance programs. So employee assistance programs are employer finance programs that are administered by a company, typically through an outside contractor. So these are programs for job stress, substance abuse, bereavement programs, so you can take time off when you lose a loved one. They promote work-life balance, and sometimes they even offer relationship counseling, because they know that when you're happy at home, then you're typically happier at work, when you're not worried about the stresses of your relationship, that's at home. So the goal of these programs are to address productivity problems that are associated with an employee's emotional, physical, and/or financial issues. So one way to do this also is to have drug testing in the workplace. So drug testing can be done through either urine, hair, blood, oral fluids, and even sweat. So according to the United States Department of Labor, based on roughly 450 randomly selected human resource managers, a study was conducted, and they found that 84% of employers in that group required new hires to pass drug screenings. 74% used drug screening when there was a reasonable suspicion of drug use. 58% of organizations used drug screens after an accident occurred, so whether that's on a job site or say you're driving a county car because you work for the county and you're in an automobile accident, they typically send those persons for drug testing. 39% of these organizations used random drug screenings, and 14% used scheduled drug screenings. So you'll see here in the table on your screen, it shows the length of time that amount of drug is able to be detected. So alcohol, they typically say 1 drink per hour. It's a little longer for women, they say. If you look at, cocaine use, if you use cocaine, it might take 2 to 10 days for it to fully come out of your system, that it won't show up on a drug test. Marijuana, it's going to depend on how frequently you're using the drug. So if it's casual use, you're not using every day, it could take 3 to 4 days for it to come out of your system. Whereas if you're a chronic user, it could take several weeks. So for those that we have on probation, typically you'll take a drug screen, send it out to the lab for levels, and you simply want to see that those levels are going down week after week, because especially for marijuana use, again, it takes such a long time to come out of the system that test could continue coming up positive for quite a number of weeks. So we're going to end with looking at the holistic self-awareness approach to drug use. So all of these 3 components work together, the mind, body, and spirit, as a unified whole to promote both health and wellness. So this holistic self-awareness approach says that health and wellness can only be achieved when all 3 of these are free from unnecessary use of psychoactive substances. So unnecessary use. So it's not saying if you have a medical need that you're not taking what you need for your own medical health and well-being, but it's saying when that use is unnecessary. This approach also says that self-awareness should lead to self-understanding and self-assurance. And it helps us understand how others can become attracted to drugs, how to detect drug use and abuse in others, and also how to identify the appropriate treatment for that person when we're considering all 3 of these components in our approaches. So in sum, biological, genetic, pharmacological, as well as social, cultural, and contextual issues are the 4 principal factors that are responsible for how a drug user will experience drug use. Drug use dates back to biblical times and ancient literature as far back as 2240 BC. Drug use is an equal opportunity affliction, meaning drug use affects all individuals, those in every social class, those in every gender, those in every ethnicity. There is no one that is immune to being afflicted by a drug use or abuse issue. Drugs are used for typically 4 different main reasons. You have legal instrumental, legal recreational, illegal instrumental, and illegal recreational. Alcohol use is the most commonly used illicit drug. And there are 3 main types of drug users: your experimenter, your compulsive user, and your flirter or your chipper. The mass media actually promotes drug use through their advertising, typically through television, but you also have some billboard ads and things and printed materials. Drug use leads to abuse when the use is excessive, the person is preoccupied with whether that drug is available, when they refuse to admit that their use is excessive, and when they're reliant on that drug. The stages of drug dependence are cyclical, including relief, leading to increased use, preoccupation with the drug, dependency on that drug then results, and withdrawal symptoms will occur if the person does not continue ingesting that drug, leading back to relief. Drug users are more likely to commit crimes. Arrestees are often under the influence of drugs while they're committing crimes, showing that drugs and violence are in fact linked. Employee assistance programs are employer-financed programs that are aimed at resolving productivity problems by helping employees that have physical, mental, or financial issues. And the holistic self-awareness philosophy is based on the idea that the mind, body, and spirit must be free from the effects of drugs in order to work best to promote health and wellness of that person. So this was your Chapter 1 lecture. I hope everyone has a lovely week.